You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Happy holidays to everybody out there. And while you guys are getting ready for the holidays, a reminder about some holiday shopping you can do with the Hazard Ground Podcast. Of course, go to our website, hazardground.com. Click on the Amazon banner right in the middle of the homepage there. Once you do that, you'll be directed to Amazon, and you can do all your Christmas shopping there. Anything that you buy from Amazon.com through our website, hazardground.com, we get a portion of the proceeds. We donate those right back to the incredible charities and organizations that you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. So doing your holiday shopping through hazardground.com and Amazon.com is a great way to help out veterans and veterans organizations all throughout America. Also, if you're looking for a particular kind of gift for that member in your family, don't forget about Combat Flip-Flops. Go to their website, combatflipflops.com, and enter the code HAZARD1, and you'll get 15% off your entire order. Again, combatflipflops.com, and the code HAZARD1. Combat Flip-Flops, an organization that was started by veterans that were featured right here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Also, one of our sponsors, Knife Country USA. You can click on their website right on our sponsors page on hazardground.com. Enter the code HAZARD1 and you will get a 10% discount on the entire order from Knife Country USA, a fantastic company, another one of the companies featured here on the Hazard Ground. So we appreciate you guys supporting all of the companies that support us. And as always, we appreciate you guys listening to the Hazard Ground. Don't forget to follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And with all that said, now let's get to this week's episode. Joining us this week is a retired E5 from the United States Army who is also a EOD technician. He spent 18 months in Vietnam. He is a lawyer who spent 23 years as a public defender and even did a counter-drug tour in Afghanistan as a civilian. He has also wrote a book called This Is What Hell Looks Like about his experience in Vietnam. He is Stu Steinberg here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Stu, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
All right, well, we appreciate you joining us. Let's go back to the beginning. Just an incredible story of how long you spent in Vietnam and survived. But we start always by asking how people got in the military. Now, this is Vietnam, so did you volunteer or were you drafted?
No, I enlisted, but the truth is the draft board was on my ass because I had flunked out of college.
Oh, really? I didn't even, was that like something they specifically targeted? I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. You know, because I had a student deferment and, the school that I was in, Eastern New Mexico University, apparently, notified my draft board. I left New Mexico, I think it was in May of 66. And I think I got a draft notice in either late June or early July of 1966. And I knew I didn't want to get drafted because in 1966, they would draft all these people and then they would line you up and tell you to count off by fours. And then they said, okay, everyone who's a four, you're in the Marines. I knew I didn't want to be in the Marines. I think I probably chose the Army because my dad had been in the Army during World War II. He was an infantry company commander. And, on July the 27th, 1966, one of my buddies and I went into D.C., where the drinking age at that time was 18. And we got staggeringly drunk, woke up the next morning, passed out in my car, and drove down to Alexandria to get some breakfast. And when I looked out the window of the restaurant we were in, all the recruiting offices were right across the street. So we had our breakfast and walked across the street and enlisted in the Army. And that was on July 28, 1966. And we actually left for the induction center that night down in Richmond, Virginia, and by the next morning we were on our way to Fort Jackson, South Carolina.
That's unreal. Like, I'm trying to Listen, we all do silly things sometimes when we've had too much to drink, but that was a life-altering decision with a hangover.
Well, I guess that's true, but I sort of felt, it was kind of my duty, I guess. I certainly had. To be honest, I didn't know that much at that time about the war in Vietnam. Despite the fact that there had been a huge buildup by 1966. But to tell you the truth, I couldn't have shown you where Vietnam was on a map, and I really didn't become fully aware, of what was going on in Vietnam until I got to basic training, where most of my drill instructors had already been to Vietnam and back. A couple of them had been in the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which I eventually ended up on operations with during my first year in Vietnam. So, even if I hadn't gotten drunk the night before, I would have still ended up enlisting because, like I said, I just didn't want to get drafted.
Well, and there's some logic to that. We've had a couple of people who have both been drafted and both chose to enlist, just simply, as you said, with a chance of kind of dictating their own career path a little bit, or likelihood of doing X, Y, and Z, as opposed to at the needs of the Army, needs of the government, whatever it may be. So you go off to basic training. Do you have this moment at basic training where you're like, wow, this was a bad idea?
No, I never did. In fact, I really, it's actually kind of a funny story. When my buddy and I got to Fort Jackson, they called us out because it turned out that during the physical at the induction center, they had discovered that my buddy had a condition that precluded him from serving. However, they told him that there was a minor surgical procedure he could undergo if he wanted to stay in, and he chose not to do that, and so they discharged him. And then they told me, because we had enlisted under the buddy program, I could get out too. And I said, well, I'm already here, so what the hell. Now, what ended up happening was they were full at Fort Jackson. So they put me in the car and drove me over the border into Georgia and took me to Fort Gordon.
Wow.
And I ended up in a basic training company. This is a riot. I was the only regular Army guy, in other words, the only enlistee in this company. Everyone else was a member of either an Army Reserve or National Guard unit from Wisconsin. And, these are all guys. I mean, some of them were, there was one guy at least who was a lawyer. There was another guy who was a big-time executive in a union. And, they had joined the Guard and the Reserves as a way, they believed, of avoiding going to Vietnam. Well, I got news for you. They were an infantry unit. So they were all going to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And because I was the only RA, the command staff, of my company, just thought I was the bee's knees. And I ended up being, the acting jack, in my company, where I wore these sergeant stripes on a thing that was, on my arm.
Right, like a sleeve that wraps around your arm.
I really ate it up. I feel like I really excelled, especially in, things like the low crawl and the ladder thing that you went across hand by hand over hand. I just really ate it up. At one point we had, guard mount, and, you were inspected by the brigade commander and whatnot. And I was chosen, the best soldier in that deal. So while everyone else was guarding a pile of tires or something, I drove around with the brigade commander. I think I got a $25 savings bond, and so wonderful. I really enjoyed basic.
And so did your buddy who had the medical exemption, he end up getting out or no?
Yeah, he got out. He got out.
And so he never had to go over?
No, he never. Yeah, he was, 4F.
Wow, that's crazy. All right, so you finish basic training.
He had a pilonidal cyst.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
All right, so you finished.
Could have been surgically repaired.
Yeah, I suppose, right? But they gave him the option, right?
Yeah, and he chose instead. Well, I thought about it now. I don't think I want to do this, and he got out.
Well, to each their own, as they say. So you finish basic training, you head off to AIT. How quickly does everything happen, and how quickly do you find out?
I actually didn't go to AIT.
Oh, really?
When my buddy and I enlisted, we let the recruiter saw us a complete line of bullshit. We really didn't know what we wanted to do, and this guy convinced us that we should go into the missile field. We would learn electronics and all kinds of cool shit that, would, serve us in civilian life. And of course, it just turned out to be BS. I ended up at a Nike Hercules missile site that was out in the middle of nowhere in the Everglades. And I mean, in the Everglades. And in fact, this missile site was actually built on, in an area that had been a Japanese prisoner of war camp during World War II.
Really?
And, and this job turned out to just be, it was complete bullshit. I mean, basically, as a Nike Hercules missile crewman, 16B, 10 or something like that, your main job was, push the missiles out of the silo, clean them with acetylene or, whatever, and, check them out and then push them back in. And, we did things like pulled weeds around the berm of our battery and a lot of guard duty. But the worst part of it was that there were a lot of people in this unit, largely from deep South states like, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. And there were a bunch of racist anti-Semitic swine. And the company commander and the first sergeant just kind of let these people do, what they did, which was fuck a lot of people over. And one of these guys, in fact, ran a loan sharking operation, which the command knew about, where they would loan money to unsuspecting privates and PFCs and then charge them, interest. You left them broke, basically, after they would get paid. So when I got close to having a year in, I knew I had to get out of there. So I took the bus into Homestead Air Force Base, which was kind of where our main support was, and went to see the career counselor. So, I told him, well, I got to do something else, man. I want to do something that means something. And he said, well, what would you think about going into explosive ordnance disposal? I said, what's that? So he said, well, it's the bomb squad. And then I said, why the hell would I want to do that? And he said, well, if you do, you'll get another $55 a month in hazardous duty pay, which isn't taxable. Now, at that time, I was a PFC making $90 a month. So $55 sounded like a really good deal to me. Plus, I got a $1,000 reenlistment bonus. And so the day I had 1 year in, July 27, 1967, I reenlisted. And I was on my way to the first phase of EOD school at Fort McClellan 2 days later.
Wow. Now, did you know, did they give you any sense of the long-term career trajectory on that? Like, did they tell you anything about Vietnam and you'd likely be going as soon as you're done, or did that not even come up?
Yeah, my memory is Vietnam never came up. But, by that time, in 1967, of course, I did know, about Vietnam. I knew what was going on. I read the papers, I watched the news, and I knew that, the situation there was fairly tense. And, by then, of course, people who kept abreast of things knew about things like the Battle of the EOD Valley and the battles at LZX, right? And so, I think, by then I knew, that, I was going to be in an MOS that would likely, take me to Vietnam. At that point, I wasn't thinking I'm going to volunteer for Vietnam, but that is eventually what I did. So.
All right. So, I mean, it's EOD schooling is extensive. It's long. So when do you actually get to Vietnam?
Yeah. I got to Vietnam on September the 4th, 1968. I graduated from EOD school in early January of 1968. The school ran from July of 68. It began at Fort McClellan, where you did chemical and biological weapon systems. I think that was about 3 weeks. And then my memory is I had a leave of maybe 10 days. So I ended up then at the EOD school, the basic school, which at that time was at Indian Head, Maryland, at the Naval Ordnance Station.
Yep.
And of course now everything is down at Eglin Air Force Base. When I graduated, me and one of the other guys I'd gone through school with, he and I'd become really good friends. We both came down on orders for Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah.
So what happens when you get there?
Well, at that time, Dugway was where we stored the vast majority of our chemical and biological weapon systems. And the team that I was on there, one of our major jobs was going through these storage areas and looking for leakers. And the primary weapon that we had to deal with that was leaking was 114. It was a rocket, a relatively long rocket, 6 or 7 feet long, that contained VX nerve gas, sarin.
Yeah. Okay.
And what we would do is we would collect the leakers and we would transport them to our demo area. We would fill the pit with tires and then lay out explosive charges and white phosphorus grenades, thermite packs, and then drench the area with hundreds of gallons of jet fuel and set it off. And it would burn. The rounds would detonate mostly. And, of course, the nerve gas would pretty much be burned out. And then a few days later, after the pit had cooled down, we would have to go through the pit and look for rounds that either hadn't detonated or where the bursters, which I can't remember if the bursters had TNT or RDX. The bursters would split open, the fire would melt the explosive, which then formed a slag that would reharden. And once it was in that condition, it was really, really dangerous. I mean, you could set off this slag just by stepping on it or moving it wrong or whatever. And during one of these operations, my teammate and I, actually the guy who I had gone through school with, and we got sent out there together, we were in the pit, and then I went back to our rig to cut charges, and all of a sudden I heard this explosion, and a piece of slag had detonated, or one of the bursters had detonated something, and Tom ended up getting hit in the thigh with a fairly large piece of shrapnel, and he had to be medevaced out, and then one of our other jobs was working on new ordnance systems. Like, for instance, I think it was called the XM54. It was a bounding mine, like an anti-tank mine, except that it was filled with white phosphorus. And when they first started testing these things, there were a lot of duds. So, one of our jobs in a case like that would be to, go in and destroy the dead, that kind of thing. So that's kind of what we did there.
Did you enjoy that, or was it? I mean, what was your reaction to having to do that? I mean, obviously, you're still not in Vietnam yet.
To tell you the truth, no, it was actually, it was pretty boring. and then on, March the 13th, in 1968, there was a nerve gas accident. An F-4 that was flying a new type of dispenser system took off, flew out away from Dugway, made a turn, and in coming back to try to get back over Dugway, where they were going to dispense this weapon in an area where they had a bunch of animals, sheep, dogs, and that kind of stuff, to see how the system worked and whatnot. And it malfunctioned. So it ended up dumping a ton of VX, sarin, nerve gas, on a sheep ranch.
Oh, man.
And it killed everything. If it walked, crawled, flew, whatever, they were dead. Everything was dead. And what was amazing was, and this was on a Thursday, for some reason, the herders who were they were all Albanians or Armenians or something, I don't know. Thursday was their day off. So all of the herders were not there. They were like in the town of Tooele, I don't know, at a bar or whatever. And but it killed all of the horses, their dogs, 7,000 sheep. And like I said, everything that walked, crawled, or flew was dead. Birds, snakes. And you know how you hear that, cockroaches can survive a nuclear blast?
Yeah.
Well, they can't survive nerve gas. They can't survive nerve gas because they have a central nervous system. So we ended up basically cleaning up this mess by having a huge pit dug. We scraped everything into the pit, set it up like we did in our demo area at Dugway, lots of tires, lots of explosives, like phosphorus and thermite, tied it all together with jet cord, dumped a couple 1,000 gallons of jet fuel in there and set it off. And after the pit had basically burned itself out, they covered it up, put a fence around it, paid the owners a lot of money, and that was kind of the end of it. And we were debriefed by people from the Department of Defense, and of course we're told we couldn't talk about what had happened, and everything was hush hush. And of course they covered this up for many, many years.
Yeah.
There used to be an investigative journalist with the Washington Post named Jack Anderson. And every year on the anniversary, Jack Anderson would write a column about what had happened and how they were covering it up and yada, yada, yada. Oh, yeah. And it turned out when I was doing my research for my book, what I discovered was this land was owned by the family of Utah Senator Orrin Hatch. And so after we got done with this cleanup, which took, a couple of weeks, I think, again, like when I enlisted, 4 of us, lower ranking guys, E4s and E5s, went down to the enlisted men's club and got really, really hammered. And the next morning, 3 of us went to personnel and volunteered for Vietnam.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I blithely thought that, well, if I go to Vietnam, at least, you can hear the enemy coming, which of course turned out to be bullshit. But it seemed like a better option than staying at Dugway. I mean, and this place was a nightmare.
Well, that's, some people might tell you probably should stop drinking. At least they're weird decisions for you somewhere down the road. But
yeah, well, I eventually did. I eventually did stop drinking.
Okay, well, good for you from that standpoint. All right, so you're heading to Vietnam. Do you know what you're doing, where you're going, everything else?
Well, I didn't know which unit I was going to go to when I went, but I knew I would end up, on a 9-man EOD team, 10th person being the clerk, and we landed at Benoit Air Base. We flew in on Flying Tiger, and what's really weird is my wife at that time was a stewardess for Flying Tiger, and the route that we took was the route that she flew, and she might well have been on that same plane with me.
Oh, really?
And my buddy Tom, and I went together. We landed at Benoit, and they trucked us over to the main Army base at Long Bay, and everybody was in a line. And then they called me and Tom out because there was someone there from our control team who was going to get us to our assignments.
All right. So when you get placed there, how quickly do you find out exactly what your mission? I mean, EOD is sort of reactionary in its nature, right?
Like, as soon as we hooked up with the clerk from control, I knew that I would be going to the 184th Ordnance Battalion, which had an EOD section, and that they were in the Central Highlands in a place called Quignon. And Tom went to the 191st Ordnance Battalion at Cameron Bay. They also had an EOD section. And eventually, I ended up on a Chinook, and Tom ended up on a C-130, and off we went.
So where do you end up, and how quickly do you get into combat? Well, before we even get into that, did you know you were going to be there for 18 months ahead of time, or is that just a product of the time?
No. I enlisted, by volunteering. I mean, at that time in the Army, typical tour was a year.
Right.
And when I had about 10 months in, they sent me to a different team. I went to the 25th Ordnance Detachment, EOD, which was up in the mountains in the Central Highlands in a place called Ankei. At that time, Ankei was the main base camp of the 4th Infantry Division, and there were elements of the 173rd Airborne Brigade there. And right after I went to the 25th, I decided to extend my tour by another 6 months. And that's how I ended up being there for 18 months.
Okay, gotcha. But back to the question I asked a moment ago about, was everything just reactionary in nature? Were you trying to be proactive and diffuse mines and things of that nature? Or kind of what was the nature of the day-to-day work?
Well, the day-to-day work was, calls came in to the team, and, 2 people would go out on the call. And it could be anything from, going down to the MP shack and picking up grenades and ammunition they had taken off of people they had arrested for one thing or another. Or, we might get called out to one of the bases somewhere, in the 2-Corps tactical zone, maybe had been mortared the night before, and they would either be duds or there would be tail fins sticking up, and they didn't know whether it was a dud or just the tail fins. And so we would go out and determine what the deal was, and if it was an actual dud, we would blow it in place, and And at the same time, the 184th, we had 2 2-man on-site teams. One 2-man team was based at Landing Zone English near a village called Bongsan. And this was the main base camp for the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. And then our second on-site team was down south of Quignon at a place called Tuliwa. We were supporting the 3rd and 4th Battalions of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. And in both of those locations, you spent 2 weeks on site, mostly, being on operations with these infantry units when they would run into booby traps or anti-tank mines, or they would go into an area for an assessment after an airstrike. And whenever there was an airstrike and, a number of bombs were dropped, anywhere from 250 to 2,000 pounders, there were going to be duds. So what would happen is these units, particularly the long-range recon guys, Green Berets, MACV advisory teams would run into these duds, and then they would call us, and we would get choppered into wherever it was, humped to the site, assess the situation, load the device, and all ass.
In doing all this every single day, it's not really a joke, but I guess that, the running punchline, if you will, about EOD guys is, do they have all their fingers, right? And so, I asked that, or I prefaced that just because, the level of uncertainty and danger in what you do, whether it's in practice or in actuality, is the results of it could be disastrous. So did any of that ever creep into your mind as you're doing all these missions on a day-to-day basis?
No, I never, as far as I remember, I never really thought about the inherent danger of what I was doing. And I think largely it was the result of we were really well trained. We believed in our mission. We were all volunteers. And, every day you did your job. Like I said, I don't remember, even after I got hurt in May of '69, after that event, I didn't, start thinking, oh, wow, this is fucked up. I could have gotten killed. I could have gotten killed. I could have gotten really seriously hurt. It just, I don't know. It just never dawned on you. At least not to me.
I do want to talk about May '69, but let me ask you one more question first. Did you ever have any other combat engagements that weren't EOD related?
Well, sometimes, in going out on an EOD mission, you ended up in direct contact with the enemy, either the Viet Cong or the NBA. You were in firefights.
Right.
And sometimes, when we flew in for some operation or another, you went in under fire, and sometimes when you were going out, you were under fire. I guess that's what you're getting at.
Did you lose any teammates while you were there?
No.
Okay.
The 184th had lost a guy just before I got there. He was killed in the Marine ammo dump at Dong Ha that had gotten blown up during the Tet Offensive of 1968, the big Tet that everyone talks about.
Right.
And they were cleaning up this dump, and they think that Lou stepped on either an armed 40-millimeter grenade warhead or something from a COFRAM round, which were artillery projectiles that opened up and dropped all these little bomblets all over the place. And these devices had anti-disturbance and anti-lift features, and that's what they think happened to Lou. It turned out that the last team I was on, the 287, which was up in northern I Corps, about 40, 50 clicks from the DMZ, was the only team in Vietnam that never lost a man. I mean,
really?
We had one guy that lost part of one of his legs when he stepped on an anti-personnel mine. But the 287th was the only team that never had a man killed. So, and that was amazing since that team was at Hamburger Hill. That team was at the Siege at Fire Base Ripcord. So, yeah. But, during my 18 months, we did lose people, from other teams. And it always, it was always really sad and really emotional because even if you didn't know this person, I think at the max, I think there were 14 teams in Vietnam and in the control unit. So you're talking about, maybe 150 guys in the whole country. So, when a team lost someone, it was very personal and it was very emotional. I was TDY in the Delta to the 44th EOD, which was at the 25th Infantry Division's main base at Kuchi. And I was there in November and December of 68. And I left there on New Year's Eve, 68, so December 31st. And that night, I landed in Saigon, and the guys at the 170th Ordnance Detachment picked me up, took me back to their unit, spend the night, and was going to fly out to Quinyon the next day. And that night, the CO of the unit, Captain Cecilia, and another member of the unit went on a call and got caught in a gun battle between Vietnamese military police and the Viet Cong, and Captain Cecilia was accidentally killed. And it was really, really an emotional deal, being there for the memorial. So.
What made it so emotional in particular?
Well, first of all, he was a really cool guy. And secondly, the men in his unit loved him. And like I said, there were so few of us in Vietnam that, when there was a loss, whether someone was killed or wounded bad enough to have to get medevac, it was a very personal thing. Maybe, on those occasions, you did think a little bit about, wow, that could happen to me. And eventually it did.
All right, so what happened in 1969 to you? I know you've been injured a couple of times. Give me the circumstances and events.
Well, during the post-Tet offensive of 1969, which began on February the 23rd, 1969, the 184th Ordnance Battalion had an ammo dump. It was the second biggest dump in Vietnam. And I think at that time, at least what I gleaned from the research I did for my book, where I was able to recover a lot of reports and after-action stuff, I think they had about 19,000 tons of ordnance. Everything from, M16 ammo to the biggest artillery rounds we had, the 8-inch round and the 175 millimeter round. So on February the 23rd, March 10th and 11th, and March the 23rd, Viet Cong sappers got into the dump and blew it the fuck up. And despite ever-increasing security, and I'm talking more guard towers, roving patrols with dogs, long-range recon ambushes, Korean Marine ambushes, they never saw anybody. They got in and out of the dump without ever being detected. So when the dump went up the first time, all three times, basically, we were inside the dump as ammunition, whole pads of all kinds of ordnance, everything from, like I said, small arms to huge artillery projectiles were mass detonating. And how it was that, we managed to get through those three attacks without having a man wounded was just, it's almost incomprehensible. Now, the Ordnance Battalion did lose three guys during the third attack, a captain and two enlisted men who went into a pad of 8-inch projectiles, which are really, really big bullets. That pad mass detonated while they were there. They were basically vaporized. And one of the sicker aspects of this fucking sick demented war was that, every week the Army Times would publish a list of all of the names of the men who were killed in action during the prior week. When that list came out after Captain Allen and these two enlisted guys were killed, they were actually listed as missing in action, presumed dead.
Was that because they couldn't find any remains?
Well, they actually did find Captain Allen's, I think, his ring finger and it had its Citadel ring on it. But that's the only thing they found. I mean, you're talking hundreds and hundreds of 8-inch rounds that went off in a mass detonation.
Wow. That's just the visual is unreal, you know?
So what happened during the cleanup, and of course, we start cleaning it up after the first attack, and then fucking, 3 weeks later, it gets hit again and pretty much wipes out all the work we'd already done. And then we start cleaning it up again, and then 2 weeks after that, they hit it again, and that wiped out all the work we had done. So fortunately, after the March 23rd attack, they didn't hit it again, and so we spent the next 3, almost 4 months cleaning up this mess. And a lot of what we did was we would collect up all of these damaged artillery and mortar rounds largely, and truck them to our demo area, which was a couple of miles down the road, and we would blow this shit up. And then the biggest problem that we had was with white phosphorus rounds, mostly 81 millimeter mortar rounds and 105 millimeter artillery projectiles, and a lot of them were leaking. And of course, you probably know, you get white phosphorus on you, and it's going to burn a hole right through you.
Yep.
The only thing that stops it is, water or dirt, whatever. So, in order to clean up the white phosphorus, we had these crates built. They were, giant wooden boxes, mostly made of 2x6s, I think. Probably, 5 by 5 around the base and 4 or 5 feet tall. And then the inside was lined with plastic and, like, I don't know, tarps or something. And we would fill up the boxes with water. And then we would pick up by hand these leaking white phosphorus rounds, or even those that weren't leaking, and put them in these boxes filled with water. You wore these kind of gloves that allowed you to work with this stuff without getting burned. And then we would eventually truck all the white phosphorus to our demo area and set it off. And man, they made a hell of an explosion. So eventually, there was so much of this ordnance that had been damaged, mostly high explosive stuff. But none of it was fused, except for the 81 millimeter mortar rounds. And I'll get to that when I talk about how I got hurt. We would, fill these boxes, not the ones we used for white phosphorus, but just regular. We'd fill these boxes with rounds, and then eventually there would be a huge convoy, and we would head south of Quinyan about, I'm thinking maybe about 90 miles to the port of Tuliwak. And we had an on-site team there. And like I said earlier, 3rd and 4th Battalions of the 173rd were based there. There was a Special Forces B team there, a lot of MACV activity. And we would load these boxes on Navy barges and truck them out into the South China Sea and dump all this bad ordnance into the South China Sea. My guess is today those rounds have been rusted through, leaked out their contents, and there's probably a huge area in the South China Sea that's just completely dead from all this ordnance we dumped there. It's kind of one of those things you didn't think about in terms of its effect on the environment.
Yeah. So. I mean, and all the explosions that you've talked about, and since we've been talking, in the back of my head, I'm going, yeah, that probably doesn't work that way if they try that in 2018. Like, we're not just blowing things up, covering with dirt and moving on about our lives. It doesn't work that easy anymore.
Yeah, EOD now is a lot different than we were in. Like I said, we had a 9-man team, 10th man being the clerk. Now EOD is like the regular army. They have companies, battalions, groups, and there's, I think, maybe 60 men and women in the company.
Yeah, well, since 9/11 happened, they've had a much bigger need for all that stuff. And roadside bombs and everything else have changed the dynamics very quickly of the need for EOD. Those are some of the busiest damn guys in Iraq. I mean, there was always, literally, there were times you could discover an IED on the road, and we did, and we called them for EOD. We'd be waiting there for 2 or 3 hours, not because they were taking their time, because they were on another mission already. And you can't put a set time on how long it takes to defuse a bomb. You have to do it the right way, and sometimes that takes some analytics and some study and everything else, and checking and double checking to make sure the guy trying to detonate the bomb doesn't set off the bomb, because you still have bad things happen. Yeah. So definitely different. But let's get back to when you got injured.
So anyway, it was May the 10th, 1969, and my teammate and I, my good buddy Roger McCormick, who I just saw again this year at our convention, and he came home with my wife and I, and spent a few days here with us in Oregon. And we were hoping to be able to get him out on a horse, but the weather didn't cooperate. Roger and I were like right at the tail end of finishing the cleanup. So one of our jobs that day was to go through every pad that we were assigned to and look for any bad or damaged ordnance, maybe something, in the dirt that had become evident after a rain or something. So we went into this pad of 8-inch artillery projectiles. And, the stacks of these 8-inch rounds were, I think, too high. So you're probably talking about, a stack of these 8-inch rounds would be, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, and they were, stacked too high. And I just happened to look up, and I saw the tail fins of an 81 millimeter mortar round sticking out of one of these stacks of 8-inch rounds. And what I saw were the tail fins. So I climbed up the stack and I looked in there, and sure enough, there was an entire round in there. Now, at that time, the 81 millimeter mortar rounds came fused, and they were fused with what was called the M524 fuse. This is a really dangerous fuse. The firing pin was separated from the detonator by something called a bore riding pin. And you may know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of wrapped around the fuse, and then the tail end of it went into the fuse and blocked the firing pin from the detonator. So what happened in the field was the mortar guys would pull out the bore riding pin, which then left the round fully armed. If you had slammed it on the ground nose first, you would have blown your ass up. And we couldn't tell when I first looked in there whether or not the bore riding pin was gone, because you just couldn't see that well. So what we ended up doing was I had it roll a combo wire in the Jeep, or a 3/4 ton truck. I don't know, like a 500-foot long roll of combo wire. So I tied one end of it to the tail fins, and Roger and I rolled it out, I don't know, a couple hundred feet or so, and got behind the rig and jerked the round loose. And, we actually could hear it. The pads had concrete floors. And we actually heard the round, hit the concrete floor, bounce around a few times, and then, it didn't go off.
Oh, you must have been literally sweating in those moments, hearing that round clank around.
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
Because
I would have been.
We were just doing our job, and when it didn't go off, we walked back up there, and that's when we discovered that not only the bore riding pin was missing, but the nose plunger was bashed down into the fuse, which meant that more than likely the firing pin was impinged in the detonator. And you knew that if you handled it wrong and the firing pin dislodged from the detonator, that would set the round off and you'd be blown to pieces. So right about that time, my CO and one of our NCOs, I called them on the radio. And he came up, and Captain Lawrence asked me, well, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, well, the rendering safe procedure for this thing is to blow it in place. And even if we sandbag it, I mean, you can't be blowing shit up in the middle of a pad of these huge artillery projectiles. And I said, I think I should sandbag it in the back of the 3/4 ton. We had a small demo area inside the dump. And I said, I'll drive it down the road to the demo area and blow it up. So in the 3/4 ton, they have, pretty big tires. And so what I did was I took the spare tire and I propped it up against the back of the driver's seat. The back of behind the seat, the back of the truck were like these wooden slats and, canvas. And then I laid out a row of sandbags, picked the round up. It didn't go off, thank God. Put it on the sandbags, and sandbagged it again, sandbags on top of the round to hold it in place. And I backed out of the pad. I got about 50 feet, and I heard this bang. And it was so loud and so close to me, I guess, it sounded like it was really far away. And, this is all happening in the space of a couple of seconds. And I remember thinking to myself, bang. And I turned around and I looked, and this fireball was coming at me because the round had gone off right over the gas tank.
Oh, man.
And right about the time I'm thinking I need to get out of this truck, the blast hit me. And at that point, I didn't even realize the doors had been blown off the truck, the windshield had been blown out, and the blast blew me out of the driver's side door. And I hit the pavement and kind of rolled down over this embankment. And I remember, turning over on my side. And at this point, my eardrums had both been perforated, and it was like having the ocean or the wind was like blowing through my head. It was like all of this noise and static and whatever. And I remember watching the truck continue down the road, completely on fire at this point. And in the book, there's a picture of what the bed of that truck looked like after the round went off. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, this truck is going to end up in a pad. It's going to blow up shit. And right about that time, what they did for fire control in this ammo dump, you didn't have regular fire trucks. They had pumpers. So there was a pond, a water pond, where they'd fill up with water and then go and fight the fire. And right about that time, the truck veered off to the left and over the embankment and went into the pond, which put out the fire. And, and then I know that, one of my teammates was kind of standing over me saying, are you okay? Are you okay? And that's the last thing I remember. The next thing I knew was I woke up, at the medevac hospital. I had no memory of being medevac or any of that other shit. And I had second-degree burns on my ears and the back of my neck, and caught a lot of shrapnel in my shoulders and my upper back. And what I didn't realize then, and of course they didn't even bother with x-rays, that has become a real problem now is the major part of the blast hit me in the lower back and really messed up my lumbar spine. And I'm now having a lot of trouble with my lumbar spine. And 2 or 3 days later, I went back to work.
Oh, really?
And yeah. And, at that point, the only thing that was still really wrong with me was I was having a lot of trouble hearing. One of my eardrums eventually healed over. The other one still has a perforation. And then, a week after I got hurt in the dump, I got hurt a second time during an incoming attack. So Yeah.
That's unreal. I mean, it's amazing that you're still alive.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If it hadn't been for that spare tire, I wouldn't be alive.
No.
That spare tire, it absorbed a lot of the shrapnel and the blast and the fire and everything else. Yeah.
Well, smart move by you. I mean, that's when training kicks in. I mean, it's whether it was a planned thing or, as far as thinking about the blast, but, regardless of that, just amazing that, that's the razor thin line between life and death sometimes in combat. When you look back on your 18 months in Vietnam, as you sit here today, all these years later, how do you characterize the experience?
Well, to be honest with you, it was maybe the best 18 months of my life.
Really?
Despite the danger and possibilities of getting seriously wounded or killed. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the men that I served with were just the best people, pretty much, that I've ever known in my whole life. Many of us are still alive. We get to see each other every year at our convention. And, I talk with these guys. We talk all the time by phone. We Skype each other. We have Zoom meetings. What's really wonderful is when we get together, it's like things were 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost as if you were just together the day before, even though it's been 40-something or 50 years.
Yeah, I can relate to that experience. It's impressive, the bonds of soldiers.
Yeah, and when I finally left in May of 1970, or March of 1970, I felt really guilty. And I would have extended again, except that my control unit said that I had so much time in grade as an E5, I had to go back to school for nuclear weapons. Otherwise, I would have stayed another 6 months.
Wow. Let me ask you, how did you feel back then, and how do you feel now about the way Vietnam veterans were treated once they returned home?
Well, I never experienced a lot of the problems that so many of my brothers and sisters who served in Vietnam experienced, people spitting on you and calling you baby killers and all that stuff. But I did run into some problems with my first wife's brother and some of his friends who were all draft dodgers. And I eventually pulled a gun on them.
Wow.
And told them if they fucked with me again, I would fucking, I would kill them. And they never bothered me again after that. I went back to school and was driving a cab full time at night. And I was actually a fairly active member in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I had met John Kerry, Ron Kovic, and a lot of the other guys who were, in the movement. And I guess after a couple of years after getting out, I was more concerned about getting a college education, and I had gotten married, and so a lot of the Vietnam stuff kind of fell by the wayside. And but I never forgot that I was a Vietnam vet, and frankly, I was always proud of the fact that I had served, and that I had served voluntarily.
When you see the way veterans are treated now, and it's this huge celebration, and there's all this appreciation and everything for veterans do now, comparatively knowing, what kind of things happened to your generation, how does that make you feel? Does it angry? Does it bother you?
Well, no, because the truth is, since the public has become so aware of, people in the military, and particularly veterans, since 9/11, it has allowed the public to recognize us and to treat us the same way.
Yeah.
In fact, we just had where I live is a kind of a ranching community, and so on Veterans Day, we dedicated an area here that's going to be a memorial to the military, veterans, and first responders. We have, thanks to me, have become a Purple Heart community. So there will be a really nice plaque in this memorial area where there will be a lot of bricks that people are buying, myself included. My brick is going to be in memory of the 43 men we lost in Vietnam. And when I'm in the grocery store, I'm either, I'm usually, this time of year I'm wearing a jacket that I got from Wounded Wear. They're called something else now. And I'll be wearing maybe an EOD hat or my Purple Heart hat or my Bronze Star with B device hat. And people stop me. They come up to me and they thank me for my service, and it's really cool. And it's very humbling, and really different than the way things were, 20 years ago.
How have you been able to deal with all of your experience and everything else? I know you said you quit drinking, but obviously there's undiagnosed PTSD there from your time. It's just undeniable.
My PTSD is diagnosed.
Oh, okay, it is. Well, they weren't diagnosing it back then.
I was diagnosed in 1993.
Really? Because that's not a term you really heard until the GWAT.
Pardon?
You didn't really hear PTSD until after 9/11.
Yeah, but I knew about it because, first of all, I was been involved in the veterans movement in several different ways. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Vietnam Veterans of America, of which I'm a founding member. I was the second person accredited by the VA as a service officer for VBA in 1978. And I was general counsel of the Vietnam Veterans of Massachusetts. And so I knew about PTSD. I knew all of the major mental health people who did the bulk of the research: Bob Lifton, John Williams, and in fact, John and I actually worked on a murder case together. I was the investigator, and he was the mental health guy that evaluated our client, who was a Marine Vietnam vet, charged with murder in New Hampshire. So what happened was, I knew I had PTSD. And why I waited so long to go to the VA for help is, something I just really don't understand. And how that happened was, my wife, my now wife, one day, we were living in Michigan at the time, got tired of me bitching about my knees. I had wrecked one of my knees when I got hurt in the ammo dump thing, and I wrecked the second one during the incoming attack. And she said, get in the car, and go to Battle Creek, and find out what the fuck is wrong with your knees. That's what I did. And
good advice.
So I'm talking to this orthopedics guy, and he's looking at my records, and he says, "Oh, you see, you got blown up." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, he started asking me a bunch of questions, and then he said, "Well, look, I think you probably got post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm going to see if I can get you in to see a shrink." So I did. I saw the shrink, and after that, I filed my first claims. But I didn't even file a claim for PTSD. I filed claims for my knees, my tinnitus, hearing loss, and the injury to my left hand from the incoming attack. I almost lost my thumb, and it had basically been stitched back together. And I don't know, 5 or 6 months later, I get this huge envelope in the mail from the VA, and I open it up, and they just rated me for PTSD at 50%. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And eventually my PTSD rating went to 70%. And then there was a period of time in 2004 and 5, right about the time I was retiring as a capital defense investigator. I actually was rated at 100% just for PTSD because I was really fucked up.
Wow.
And really depressed. And the work that I did as a capital defense investigator meant, for like 10 years, having to go into these murder crime scenes where there was fucking blood everywhere. And, we would end up, after getting discovery from the state, with hundreds of photographs of the victim, the body, blood, whatever. And it just eventually got to the point where I knew, after the last case that I did, I couldn't keep doing that because it was really making me crazy. Between the bad shit I saw in Vietnam and the bad shit I saw during these, 9 or 10 capital cases I worked on, I just couldn't do it anymore. So I retired in 2005.
Unreal. I mean, just incredible, and a testament to your will and fortitude that, you're still here, still going on, and still living your life to the best that you can, given everything that you've experienced both in Vietnam and as a civilian.
Yeah. I mean, eventually, I am retired. What happened was in 2005, myself and 8 other Vietnam vets got together and we started an organization called Central Oregon Veterans Outreach. And I was doing VA claims, and what we were doing is we were providing services to veterans that were in the dozens of homeless camps in the woods and out in the desert here in Central Oregon. We were stockpiling things like firewood, winter clothing, sleeping bags, tents, propane tanks, and food. We were getting MREs from the National Guard that that had expired based on their whatever it is, but those things never expire. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan, I was eating MREs that were like 15 years old. So, and then eventually, Central Oregon Veterans Outreach, or COVO, I wrote a grant for HUD money, and the city of Bend ended up giving us $500,000, and we used that money to buy our first real estate property, which became a transitional housing program, where we would get these homeless vets off the street or out of the woods and into the house and get them the services that they needed, and try to get them to the point where they could go back into civilian life, with job skills and, an education. And, I would get them rated by the VA for whatever problems they were having, until the point when, COVO is now a real estate behemoth. They own property all over Central Oregon. They have, housing for vets, and they have one project. I think it's a triplex that's for single women vets who have kids. And so, this is what I was doing. And in 2007, I got called by an attorney who had just been appointed to take a look at the conviction of the first kid, 15-year-old kid, that has been sentenced under this draconian Oregon law called Measure 11, which allowed 15, 16, and 17-year-olds to be tried as adults. And this was the first kid to be sentenced to life in prison under this law.
Wow.
And so I unretired, and I did the investigation on this case and ended up learning that this kid's lawyer and his investigators had done absolutely nothing. They lied about the hours they had put in. They lied about, witnesses they claimed they had interviewed, because I went out and actually interviewed the 50 or 60 or however many witnesses that were involved in this case. None of them knew what I was talking about. When I asked them, well, what did you tell the other investigators? And they said, what other investigators? So we ended up, the conviction was overturned on the basis of professional negligence. And the kid was offered a deal for manslaughter. We took it, and he was free. And I retired again. And then in 2009, I got a call from a buddy of mine who was running this counter-narcotics program for the UN in Afghanistan, and he asked me to come to Afghanistan. So I went to Afghanistan.
It's unreal. It's amazing. Just what a trajectory and what a path.
And then I retired again.
I retired again, yeah. Sensing a pattern here. Maybe you should stop retiring.
My wife said that's it. I actually was going to take another 90-day contract, and but we had run into some really serious shit in the last month I was there. Now, what I was doing is I was an advisor along with my other teammates to a brigade of the Afghan Border Police based outside of Herat up in the northwest corner, about 100 clicks from the border crossing into Iran at Islam Kala. And we taught classes to the NCO cadets and the command staff. And I taught courses in IEDs, ordnance identification, and tactical convoy movement. And then we would help them develop intel that we got from local people and plan interdiction operations. And then we would we would run these interdiction operations, mostly along the Iranian border.
Wow. Well, Stu, listen, I mean, what an amazing tale, what an amazing, story, and just everything that you've done, everything that you've been through. It's a testament that you're still here and still willing to do your part and you're in the fight. And well, now that you're officially retired, but still, it's just to watch you go back over and over again to help out in any way you can is certainly commendable. And we certainly appreciate you sharing your story.
Well, thanks.
Stu Steinberg, thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground podcast.
All right. I really appreciated it.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.